My name is Clara Winslow, and I'm 59 years old. The moment I poured the tea, my aunt leaned close and whispered, "You don't belong here." I smiled, even though her words cut deeper than the porcelain in my hand. She thought she was putting me in my place. She didn't know she was awakening the woman I had buried for years, because before that tea even cooled, fate turned the table on her, in the most unexpected way. I've lived most of my life in quiet corners, places where people don't look too closely and memories can settle like dust. But that morning, as my cab turned down the long gravel driveway to my aunt's estate, I realized some memories never really rest. They just wait, like ghosts behind silk curtains, ready to appear the moment you walk back through old doors. It had been almost 20 years since I'd last seen Aunt Beatrice. In my childhood, she was the kind of woman everyone in town admired. Sharp, elegant, perfectly dressed even to water her roses. But beneath the perfume and pearls, there was something else. Something cold. My mother used to call it the frost of privilege. I saw it in her eyes the moment she opened the door. "Clara," she said, voice tight as the pearls around her throat, "so good of you to come, after all this time." Her words were polite, but her tone wasn't. It carried that familiar strain, one that reminded me I wasn't supposed to belong in her world. Still, I smiled. I had promised myself I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing how much her disapproval still stung. The house looked exactly as I remembered, chandeliers glittering like frozen raindrops, portraits of ancestors staring down from gilt frames, and the faint smell of lemon polish and superiority. I followed her into the drawing room, where the tea was already set, china cups, silver spoons, and steam curling from a porcelain teapot like a sigh. "I thought we might talk before Adrian arrives," she said, seating herself with the grace of someone who's always known where they fit. I sat opposite her, the chair too soft, the silence too loud. "It's been a long time since I've seen him," I said carefully. Her lips twitched. "He's been traveling, doing well for himself. You'll see." Her "you'll see" carried more meaning than she probably intended. It wasn't pride, it was comparison. Adrian, her son, the golden boy who'd gone abroad and made something of himself, and me, the niece who'd stayed behind, who'd worked in a bookstore to keep the lights on, who'd never quite risen above her mother's debts or her father's absence. Beatrice lifted the teapot, her movements smooth and deliberate. "Sugar?" I nodded, watching her pour. The tea was amber, rich, and steaming, but her next words cooled it instantly. She leaned closer, her perfume heavy and suffocating. "Clara," she whispered, "you don't belong here." The words sliced through me like the fine edge of her silver butter knife. I blinked once, twice, forcing a polite smile onto my lips. "I suppose not," I murmured. "But it's kind of you to invite me anyway." Her smile was small and cruel. Family obligations are family obligations. She sat back, satisfied, as if putting me in my place had restored some sort of natural order. I stirred my tea slowly, letting the sugar dissolve, my mind floating somewhere between hurt and anger. The sound of the spoon clinking against porcelain was the only thing that kept me steady. As the tea cooled, I remembered why she'd invited me in the first place. Adrian, her son, my cousin. He had just returned from working overseas, and Beatrice wanted to host a family tea to welcome him back. The invitation had arrived written in her flawless cursive, all politeness and pretense. I'd almost declined, but curiosity, or maybe foolishness, made me come. When I was a girl, Adrian and I had been inseparable. We'd built forts in the garden, caught frogs by the stream, and whispered secrets under the old willow tree. He used to say I was his favorite cousin, though I was his only one. But when my father died, and my mother and I had to move to a small cottage outside town, the visits stopped. Beatrice said we needed space. What she meant was that she didn't want her son spending time with someone who wore hand-me-downs. I remember my mother crying in the kitchen the day Beatrice sent a basket of donations. Old dresses, bruised fruit, a note that said, "Do let me know if you need more." My mother had smiled through her tears and whispered, "One day, Clara, kindness will find its way back." Sitting there now, across from the woman who had humiliated us, I wondered if kindness ever did find its way, or if it just learned to hide. Beatrice sipped her tea, eyes darting toward the door. "He should be here any moment," she said. "I imagine you'll find him different. Different." The word hung between us like a challenge. I wondered if Adrian even remembered me, or if time and distance had smoothed away the parts of him that once cared. I lifted my cup, forcing myself to meet her gaze. "I'm sure he's done well. You must be proud." "I am," she replied, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. "He's everything his father was, and more." There it was again, that unspoken divide. My father, the dreamer who built Beatrice's first business before dying, broke and uncredited. Her husband, the man who profited from it. I could almost hear her thoughts. "You're the daughter of the help." I set the cup down carefully. "Family is a funny thing, Aunt Beatrice," I said softly. "We spend our lives pretending the blood makes us close, when really it just makes the cuts deeper." For the first time, she looked unsettled. The teapot trembled slightly in her hand, and then, before either of us could speak, a voice came from the doorway. "Clara?" I turned, and there he was. Adrian. Tall, confident, but with the same warmth in his eyes I remembered from childhood. The years had changed him, yes, but there was something in his expression, something tender, that made my breath catch. Beatrice straightened in her seat. "Adrian, darling, come in. We were just having tea." He smiled at me, not her. "I can see that," he said softly. And as I stirred the last bit of sugar into my cup, I felt the room shift, just slightly, like the air before a storm. Adrian's smile was exactly as I remembered, bright enough to make you forget the shadows around it. He crossed the room in a few long strides, his presence filling the air in a way that instantly softened the tension. "Clara," he said, his voice warm and low. "It's been too long." I stood, unsure whether to offer my hand or a hug. He made the decision for me, wrapping me in an embrace that startled even his mother. I could feel the stiffness radiating from Aunt Beatrice across the room. She tried to keep her composure, but the corners of her mouth twitched like she was swallowing something bitter. "It's good to see you, Adrian," I managed, my voice unsteady from surprise. He pulled back and looked at me. Really looked. "You haven't changed much," he said. "Still the same kind eyes." I laughed softly, though my chest ached. "And you? Well, you've turned into quite the gentleman." Beatrice cleared her throat sharply. "Adrian, darling, perhaps Clara would like to freshen up before dinner?" Adrian ignored her. "Nonsense. We're family. Come, sit. Tell me what you've been up to all these years." He gestured for me to sit beside him on the sofa, the same one that used to be off limits to me as a child. I hesitated, but the genuine affection in his tone made it impossible to refuse. Beatrice sat rigidly in her armchair, the queen on her throne, watching as if afraid the furniture might lose its polish just by touching me. As we talked, I couldn't help but drift back to our childhood. We had been inseparable once, 2 children chasing fireflies through the garden, hiding cookies from the cook, whispering secrets under the old willow tree. I remember the day Beatrice found us sharing a blanket by the pond and pulled Adrian away by the wrist, saying, "You mustn't waste your time with people who don't know their place." After that, I saw less and less of him. The letters he promised to write never came, though I later learned his mother had intercepted them. Now, sitting beside him again, I saw traces of that boy in the man. Same quick smile, same searching eyes. But there was a new edge, too, the confidence of someone used to being in control. "So," I asked, "how was your life abroad?" He smiled, leaning back. "Busy, rewarding, but lonely, if I'm honest. Coming back here, seeing you, it feels right somehow, like home." That word, home, caught in my throat. "You must have missed your mother?" I said carefully. He glanced at Beatrice, then back at me. "I missed my family," he replied. "All of it." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "Well," she said briskly, "I suppose you'll both have plenty of time to reminisce. I've arranged a dinner party tonight. Some of the town's more distinguished guests will be attending." "Distinguished," I repeated, knowing that was code for wealthy or important. "Yes," she said, smiling tightly. "I thought it would be nice to introduce Adrian to people who truly belong in this circle." The emphasis on belong wasn't subtle. Later that afternoon, while I was walking in the garden to clear my head, Beatrice joined me. The crisp air carried the faint scent of roses and tension. "I see Adrian's quite taken with you," she said, her tone syrupy, but her eyes sharp. "He's just being kind," I replied. She smiled thinly. "Don't confuse kindness with belonging, Clara. You've always been easily swayed by affection. That's why I worry for you." The words landed like tiny darts. I folded my hands together to hide their trembling. "Thank you for your concern, Aunt Beatrice, but I know my place." "Good," she said simply, then turned and walked away, her heels clicking like a metronome of judgment. As I stood there, the memories came flooding back. My mother counting pennies at the kitchen table, the way people at church would glance at our worn coats, the endless reminders that we didn't quite fit anywhere. Years of quiet dignity, holding my head high even when I wanted to disappear. I thought I'd grown numb to humiliation, but Beatrice's words that day reopened every old wound. When I returned inside, one of the servants, a kind older woman named Mavis, approached me quietly. "Miss Clara," she said in a hushed tone, "forgive me for speaking out of turn, but you should be careful tonight." "Careful?" I asked. Her eyes darted toward the hallway. "Mrs. Beatrice has plans for this evening's dinner. Something to embarrass you, I think. She told cook to make sure you were seated opposite her, so she could see your reaction." My stomach tightened. "Thank you, Mavis." She nodded quickly and hurried off before anyone saw her talking to me. I spent the next hour alone in the guest room, staring at the reflection in the mirror. My dress was simple compared to the clothes I knew Beatrice's friends would wear, but it was clean and pressed. I straightened my shoulders and practiced my smile. I wouldn't let her break me, not again. When the dinner bell finally rang, I descended the staircase, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses growing louder with each step. The table was long, gleaming under the chandelier, the guests already seated and buzzing with conversation. Beatrice sat at the head, her diamonds glittering like frost. Adrian rose from his seat and came around to pull out a chair for me, his gesture earning a few curious glances. "Everyone," he said cheerfully, "this is my cousin Clara. I'm so glad she could join us tonight." Beatrice's lips tightened. "Yes," she said, "quite unexpected." Dinner began, polite conversation masking the undercurrent of tension. I kept my voice calm, my smile steady, determined to endure whatever spectacle Beatrice had planned. And then, midway through the meal, Adrian stood and lifted his glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "To family, and to Clara, the truest heart among us." The room fell silent. Beatrice's fork froze midair. My pulse thundered in my ears. I could feel every eye at the table turn toward me as he raised his glass higher. "To Clara," he said again, his voice clear and deliberate. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The chandelier's crystals shimmered, the silver cutlery gleamed, and yet the air was so heavy it might as well have been made of stone. I sat frozen, every eye at the table fixed on me, every whisper of breath waiting for my reaction. Adrian's glass caught the light as he smiled gently. "To Clara," he repeated, his tone warm, unwavering. "For her resilience, her kindness, and her grace, qualities this family could learn from." A faint tremor ran through Aunt Beatrice's hand as she set her fork down. The corners of her lips twitched upward, forming a smile so tight it could have cracked glass. "How touching," she murmured. I wasn't aware we were turning dinner into a charity tribute. A few of the guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Adrian didn't flinch. "No charity here, Mother, just respect where it's due." The tension rippled through the room like heat from a flame. I wanted to disappear, to shrink into my chair and melt into the wallpaper. But part of me, some quiet, buried part, wanted to stay, to see how far he was willing to go. Adrian lifted his glass again, his eyes locked on mine. "Claire has always reminded me of Grandmother Eleanor," he said. "You remember her, don't you? The way she treated everyone with kindness, no matter their station. She believed that grace wasn't inherited, it was chosen." The mention of my late grandmother's name made the guests stir. Grandmother Eleanor had been the only one in that house who ever made me feel seen. She used to slip me sweets when Aunt Beatrice wasn't looking, whispering, "You shine in places your aunt can't reach." Beatrice's smile faltered. "Adrian, I hardly think this is the time." But he went on, his voice gaining quiet strength. I remember how she used to sit Clara and me by the fire, reading to us. She'd say that real family isn't measured by money, but by loyalty. I think she'd be proud to see Clara here tonight. A lump rose in my throat. My vision blurred, and I blinked hard, forcing the tears back. Crying here, in front of Beatrice's guests, would only give her more power. "Adrian," I said softly, "that's enough. You don't need to—" But before I could finish, one of the guests, a tall man with a heavy gold watch, leaned forward with a polite but pointed smile. "Forgive me for asking," he said, "but Clara, do you still live in that little cottage near the train tracks? I think I've passed it once or twice." The question was soaked in condescension, wrapped in the false sweetness of curiosity. I opened my mouth, but Beatrice beat me to it. "Why, yes," she said with a smirk. "Clara has always preferred simplicity. It suits her." Her tone made the word simplicity sound like squalor. The guest smiled thinly, waiting for my reaction. Before I could speak, Adrian cut in, his voice sharp enough to slice through the laughter. "Not for long." The words hit the table like thunder. Forks stopped midair. Even the servants paused. Beatrice turned to him slowly, disbelief etched into every line of her face. "Excuse me?" Adrian leaned back, calm but deliberate. "I said, not for long. Clara deserves better. She's done more for this family than most people in this room, though some of you are too proud to see it." The silence that followed was deafening. One of the women at the table cleared her throat, forcing a brittle laugh. "Well, that's quite passionate, Adrian." He smiled politely, but his gaze never left his mother. "Passion isn't always a flaw, Mrs. Langley. Sometimes it's the only thing that tells the truth." Beatrice's hand trembled as she reached for her napkin. It slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor, landing softly in the hush. The sound was small, but it was enough. Everyone saw it for what it was. Not clumsiness, but fury. "I think," she said, her voice cold and trembling, "you're forgetting your place, Adrian." And she, her eyes darted to me, certainly doesn't have one here. Adrian's expression softened, almost pitying. "Maybe that's the problem, Mother. Maybe you've spent too long deciding who belongs and who doesn't." My heart thudded in my chest. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. The guests shifted in their seats, pretending to sip their wine, eager to avoid taking sides. I wanted to speak, to defend him, or maybe to calm the storm, but the words caught in my throat. Part of me wanted to flee, but another part wanted to stay and see the battle play out. Adrian turned to me, his voice gentler now. "Don't let her make you feel less than you are, Clara. You've earned your place at this table." The tremor in his voice wasn't anger, it was conviction. Beatrice's cheeks flushed scarlet. "You will not embarrass this family in front of guests," she hissed. He met her gaze without fear. "Then perhaps it's time this family stopped being an embarrassment." A collective gasp ran through the room. The air crackled with something dangerous and alive. Beatrice stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. "I think we've all had enough of this nonsense," she snapped. But Adrian didn't move. He kept his eyes on me, his voice low but steady. "No, I don't think we have." Under the table, I felt a gentle pressure, his hand finding mine. It was warm, steady, deliberate. I froze, the blood rushing to my ears. His thumb brushed across my knuckles, silent reassurance in the middle of chaos. Beatrice's eyes flicked downward, realizing what had happened. Her breath caught. Something in the air shifted again. Not just discomfort this time, but disbelief, curiosity, scandal. And as Adrian's fingers tightened around mine, I realized this wasn't just defiance. It was a declaration. Quiet, but unmistakable. Whatever had begun with that simple toast had just cracked the surface of something much deeper. The dinner ended in a silence so sharp it could have drawn blood. Guests made excuses to leave early, their polite smiles brittle and their eyes darting anywhere but toward me. Aunt Beatrice kept her expression frozen in a perfect mask of grace, thanking each guest with hollow warmth. But the moment the last door shut behind them, that mask cracked. I lingered by the staircase, pretending to straighten my shawl while I listened. Her voice came from the far end of the hallway, low, clipped, but filled with fury. "Philip," she hissed, If Adrian insists on continuing this nonsense, I want his inheritance revised immediately. Her lawyer, an older man with thinning gray hair, spoke in a nervous whisper. Mrs. Fairmont, it's not as simple as that. Your husband's will— I don't care what the will says, she snapped. I will not have my son throw away generations of standing for a— She stopped short, lowering her voice even further. For her. The word her struck like a dart. It was as if my existence was a stain she couldn't scrub out. I froze, hidden behind the archway, my heart hammering. The lawyer cleared his throat softly. Perhaps he just needs time to reconsider. If we confront him now, it could drive him further toward her. Beatrice's heels clicked against the marble floor. Then we remind him what he stands to lose. Money speaks louder than misplaced affection. Their footsteps grew faint, fading toward her study. I pressed a hand against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. So this was her game. Control through wealth, the same way she'd ruled this family for decades. And now I was the threat she needed to eliminate. I slipped out quietly, stepping into the cool night air of the back garden. The moonlight washed over the roses, and for the first time that evening, I could breathe again. The tension of the dinner still clung to me like smoke, but the silence was a small mercy. I didn't hear Adrian until he was right behind me. I thought I'd find you out here, he said softly. I turned, startled, but not surprised. His jacket was undone, his tie loosened, an image of disheveled defiance. You should be inside, I murmured. Your mother's not pleased. He gave a short laugh. That's one way to put it. I managed a small smile. She wants to cut you off, you know. I heard her. He didn't look shocked, just tired. Of course she does. She's been threatening that since I was 12. Back then it was because I wanted to study literature instead of finance. He stepped closer, the gravel crunching softly beneath his shoes. Clara, I'm sorry about what happened tonight. She had no right to treat you that way. She's always treated me that way, I said quietly. I should be used to it by now. He shook his head. No one should ever get used to being belittled. His voice was gentle, but it carried weight, the kind that pressed against your heart until you had to look away. You didn't have to defend me, I said. You'll only make things worse for yourself. Maybe I don't care, he said, eyes steady on mine. Maybe I should have stood up for you years ago. The night breeze lifted a strand of hair across my cheek, and he reached out, brushing it aside. The gesture was simple, but it made my breath catch. I took a step back, not from fear, but from the feeling that if I didn't, something inside me might unravel. Adrian, I began, but he cut me off with a faint smile. Do you remember the summer we caught fireflies by the pond? He asked. You said you wanted to keep them forever, but I told you the light would fade if we trapped them. I nodded slowly. You said we had to let them go, even if it hurt. He looked at me then. Really looked, with the same openness I remembered from that night under the stars. I meant it then, but I also said something else. I promised I'd make things right one day. Maybe this is my chance. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the years had taught me that promises made in innocence rarely survive the weight of family pride. Gratitude mixed with unease in my chest. Adrian, I don't want to be the reason you lose everything. He laughed softly, but it wasn't amused. Everything? What good is everything if you can't choose who matters to you? Before I could answer, the garden lights flickered, and Beatrice's voice sliced through the night. There you are, she said, stepping onto the stone path. Her tone was syrupy sweet, the kind that fooled guests, but not me. Such a lovely evening, isn't it? Adrian's jaw tightened. Mother. She ignored him, turning her attention to me. Clara, dear, I do hope you haven't misunderstood my son's generosity. He's always been sentimental. It's quite charming, until it becomes dangerous. I stiffened. Dangerous? Oh, not in a literal sense, she said with a soft laugh. But some family lines simply aren't meant to mix. I'd hate for either of you to forget that. Her words hung in the air, smooth and poisonous. She looked at me, the way one might look at a stray animal, something that didn't belong but lingered anyway. Adrian stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. Maybe it's time we rewrote those lines. Beatrice's eyes widened, the faintest flicker of fear breaking through her mask. What did you just say? He smiled, calm and unflinching. You heard me. The garden went still, The only sound, the whisper of wind through the roses. Beatrice stared at him, realizing for the first time that the son she'd controlled for decades might finally be slipping out of her grasp. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small at all. Morning sunlight poured through the high arched windows of the dining hall, painting the room in shades of gold that felt far too gentle for the storm I knew was brewing. Aunt Beatrice had insisted on a family brunch, as though the chaos of last night's dinner could be smoothed away by fresh croissants and polite smiles. But the air was still sharp, heavy with unspoken words. I sat at the far end of the long oak table, a place clearly chosen to keep me distant from Beatrice's circle of comfort. Adrian, however, took the seat beside me, earning his mother's daggered stare before he even unfolded his napkin. "Sleep well, Mother?" he asked lightly, reaching for the coffee pot. Beatrice's lips tightened. I would have, if my home hadn't turned into a circus last night. I stayed quiet, eyes fixed on the steam curling from my teacup. I could feel the tension pulsing between them, like two storms preparing to collide. Adrian set down the pot, his smile faint. Perhaps what you call a circus is simply the truth refusing to stay silent. Her gaze snapped toward me. And what truth would that be? That a woman who's lived her life in obscurity suddenly finds comfort here. How convenient. Her tone dripped with venom, but Adrian didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at me, calm, reassuring. "Clara deserves more than your contempt." I shook my head subtly, a silent plea for him not to push, but he was already too far gone, his resolve set. The servants moved quietly in the background, setting out fruit and pastries, pretending not to hear. But their glances, quick, curious, told me they already sensed something coming. Beatrice folded her napkin neatly in her lap. "If this infatuation of yours continues, Adrian, I'll have no choice but to take action. I won't have you ruin the Fairmont name over a passing fancy." He leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "It's not a passing fancy." Her laugh was sharp. "Then what is it? Pity? Defiance? Or perhaps she's cleverer than I thought, knowing exactly which strings to pull." I could feel my face flush, the old humiliation flooding back. "Aunt Beatrice, please." But Adrian cut across me, his voice rising. "Enough. You've spent your life tearing down anyone who doesn't fit your perfect picture. You did it to my father, to Clara's mother, and now to me." Her hand froze halfway to her cup. "How dare you compare?" "I dare," he interrupted, "because someone has to." The room fell silent. Even the ticking clock on the mantel seemed to hesitate. And then he turned to me. It happened so fast I almost thought I was dreaming. Adrian stood, pulling something from his jacket pocket, a small velvet box. The sunlight caught the gold band inside, and the room inhaled collectively. "Clara," he said softly, "you've always been the only one who ever made this house feel like home. I don't care about the whispers or the money or what my mother thinks. I care about you." My breath caught. The world tilted slightly, as though reality itself had stumbled. "Adrian, don't!" He dropped to one knee beside my chair. "Marry me." Gasps rippled around the room. One of the servants dropped a plate. Beatrice's hand flew to her chest, her face draining of color. "You've lost your mind," she hissed. "You can't be serious." He didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed on me, steady, searching. "Say yes," he whispered. "Not for them. For us." I sat frozen, every heartbeat echoing like thunder. Joy and fear collided inside me until I couldn't tell one from the other. My lips parted, but no sound came. Beatrice's chair screeched against the floor as she stood. "This is absurd! She's manipulating you, Adrian. Can't you see it? This woman has always envied what she couldn't have. She's after your money, your name." "Stop," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. "You don't get to talk about her that way. Not after everything you've done." "What I've done," Beatrice spat. "I've given you everything." Adrian stood, his presence towering now, no longer her obedient son. "You gave me chains and called it love. You've spent your life controlling people, father, the servants, even Clara's family. You used kindness like a weapon." Her breath came fast, shallow. "You ungrateful boy." I found my voice then, trembling but clear. "Please don't fight because of me." Adrian turned to me, his expression softening. Clara, you're the reason I finally can fight. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to tell him I cared, that I always had. But the room felt like it was closing in, every gaze pressing down on us. And then, like a cold gust through the warmth, a memory surfaced. Years ago, when Adrian had come to my mother's cottage in secret, I had been hanging laundry when I heard his knock. He'd brought a box of chocolates and a letter he never sent. If things were different, he'd said, I'd ask you to stay with me. But someday I'll make things right. Now, standing before me, around us, the servants whispered. Scandal always moved faster than truth. Beatrice's fury darkened the air itself. She snatched her gloves from the table, her voice shaking with rage. I will not stand by while you disgrace this family. You'll regret this, Adrian. I swear it. She turned and stormed from the room, her heels striking the marble like gunshots. The door slammed and silence rushed back in. Adrian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. She won't make this easy, he said quietly. I stared at him, my heart pounding. Adrian, what have you done? He turned to me, his gaze fierce but tender. What I should have done years ago. He took my hands in his grip warm and certain. Do you trust me enough to fight back? The question hung between us, trembling with possibility, and I knew the answer would change everything. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the echo of Beatrice's last words. You'll regret this. The sound of them rolled through my mind like distant thunder. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't let Adrian fight a battle he didn't fully understand, not without knowing what kind of house he was defending. The truth had been buried for decades, hidden beneath generations of Fairmont pride, but I knew where to find it. After breakfast, while Beatrice locked herself in her study and Adrian met with a supplier in town, I asked a driver to take me home. The little cottage near the train tracks looked even smaller after days in that mansion, but as I stepped through the door, I felt something stronger than shame. I felt purpose. The air was still thick with the faint scent of lavender from my mother's old sachets. I went straight to the attic, my heart pounding, and found the trunk where my mother had kept everything that mattered. Letters, photographs, and the brittle remains of dreams never fulfilled. I brushed away the dust and opened the lid. There they were, the letters my father had written before his death, sealed in envelopes yellowed by time. My hands trembled as I unfolded one. My dearest Lila, it began, addressed to my mother. I fear Beatrice's husband means to rewrite the agreement. I trusted him, but I see now that trust was foolish. The estate deed was meant to bear both our names. If anything happens to me, keep these letters safe. One day, Clara may need them. My breath caught. Another letter detailed transactions and signatures, proof that my father had been co-owner of the Fairmont estate. Beatrice's husband had forced him to sign a withdrawal agreement while my father was ill, claiming it was for tax purposes. Weeks later, my father was gone, and we were left with nothing but condolences and closed doors. I felt my knees weaken. My whole life, I'd believed poverty was our inheritance, when in truth, it had been stolen. By the time I returned to the mansion, the sun was setting, bleeding red across the horizon. Adrian was waiting at the door, worry etched across his face. Clara, where have you been? I was worried. I went home, I said, holding up the letters. And I found something you need to see. We went into the library where the evening light spilled across the shelves. I spread the papers across the desk. The ink faded, but still legible. Adrian bent over them, reading silently, his expression darkening with every word. This, he muttered, tracing the signature at the bottom of the page. This changes everything. Your father, he was my grandfather's partner? Yes, I whispered. Half of this estate should have been his. But your father and my aunt ensured that never happened. Adrian sank into a chair, disbelief washing over him. She knew, he said finally. She must have known all along. She did, I said. And she let my mother struggle, knowing what she'd taken. He sat back, his jaw tight. We can't keep this hidden. She's used her version of the story to control everyone for years. It's time someone told the truth. I hesitated. Adrian, if we do this, it will destroy her reputation. And yours. He looked up at me, eyes steady. Then so be it. I'd rather lose a name built on lies than live under it. Before I could respond, the door creaked open. Beatrice's lawyer, Philip, stood there, smoothing his tie nervously. "Forgive me, but Mrs. Fairmont asked me to check on you both." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Did she, or did she send you to spy?" Philip glanced at the letters on the desk, and his face went pale. "Ah, I see. You found them." I folded my arms. "You knew." He hesitated. "Mrs. Fairmont thought it best to simplify the arrangement at the time. She was only protecting her interests." I stepped closer. "At the cost of my family's future?" Philip sighed, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Fairmont asked me to offer you a settlement. Generous compensation if you agree to destroy those letters and keep this matter private." Adrian shot to his feet. "You're bribing her?" "Call it preserving dignity," the lawyer murmured. "Scandal helps no one." I looked down at the papers, then back at him. "My mother lived in shame for 30 years because of your dignity. I won't sell her memory for a price." He shifted uncomfortably. "You'll regret this." I straightened my shoulders. I already regret not fighting sooner. Philip gathered his briefcase, muttering something under his breath before leaving the room. The heavy door closed behind him with a finality that made the silence ring. Adrian turned to me. "We need to go public with this. A gathering, a formal announcement, something that forces her to face it." The thought made my stomach twist. "Adrian, you saw how she reacted to the proposal. If we humiliate her publicly, she'll never forgive you." "She already hasn't," he said. "And maybe forgiveness isn't what she deserves." I moved to the window, staring out at the garden bathed in twilight. "I don't want to fight her, Adrian. I just want to be free of her shadow." He came up beside me, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Then let's bring everything into the light. That's the only way shadows disappear." I looked at him, torn between fear and resolve. "You really think the truth will save us?" His voice was soft but certain. "It's the only thing that ever can." I took a deep breath. "Then we'll do it, but carefully." He nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Tomorrow night, I'll invite the same guests. We'll tell them everything." I gathered the letters, clutching them to my chest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't powerless. I held the truth, and the power to rewrite history. But as we left the library, the faint sound of movement caught my ear. I turned toward the doorway, my heart sinking. Beatrice stood in the shadows, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. She had heard every word. Her smile was calm, too calm. "So," she said softly, "the prodigal son and his charity case are plotting revolutions now." The chill in her voice sent a shiver down my spine, and in that moment I realized the battle had only just begun. The night of the party arrived, draped in glitter and deceit. From the driveway, the Fairmont mansion looked almost heavenly. Lanterns glowing along the stone path, violins floating through open windows, laughter spilling like champagne. But beneath the elegance, I could feel something sharp and waiting, like a blade hidden in silk. Aunt Beatrice had outdone herself. Her last stand would be nothing less than magnificent. She moved through the hall in a gown of dark emerald satin, every pearl and diamond perfectly placed. To the untrained eye, she was the picture of grace and control. But I saw the stiffness in her smile, the faint tremor in her hands. She had invited nearly everyone of importance in town, politicians, business owners, old family friends, people whose opinions mattered more to her than blood ever did. To them, the Fairmonts were untouchable. Tonight, Adrian and I were about to change that. When we entered the grand hall, hand in hand, the whispering began almost immediately. "Is it true? I heard she used to clean books in a shop. Beatrice must be furious." I caught fragments of gossip trailing behind us like smoke, but Adrian's grip around my hand never loosened. "Ignore them," he murmured. "They don't matter anymore." Beatrice spotted us across the room and offered a smile so polished it almost shone. "Ah, the happy couple," she called out, her voice rich with false warmth. "How lovely of you to join us." "Wouldn't miss it," Adrian replied, his tone cool. She gestured toward the stage at the end of the ballroom, where a string quartet played softly. "We'll begin soon," she said, as though this were any other elegant evening. I knew better. This wasn't a celebration, it was theater. The guests gathered as Beatrice took the stage, her champagne glass glinting in the light. "My dear friends," she began, her tones syrupy and commanding. "Thank you for joining us tonight. It brings me such joy to celebrate the bonds of family and the traditions that define us." She paused, letting her gaze drift toward me before continuing. "Family," she said, "is about heritage, integrity, and knowing where one belongs." The hypocrisy in her voice made my stomach twist. Adrian felt me tense beside him and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. "Of course," Beatrice went on. "Every family has its little complications, but in the end, blood and values must prevail." I saw several guests glance at us, curious, expectant. They were here not just for dinner, but for drama. They could sense the performance building. That's when Adrian stepped forward. "Mother," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "since we're celebrating family, perhaps we should be honest about what that really means." Her hand froze mid-gesture. "Adrian, please, not now." "Yes, now," he said firmly. "You've spent years preaching about legacy and belonging, but your version of family has always been built on lies." The room hushed instantly. The quartet stopped playing. Beatrice's smile faltered. "I don't know what you're implying." "Oh, I think you do." Adrian turned toward the crowd, his voice steady and clear. "My cousin Clara was not some distant poor relative who overstayed her welcome. Her father, my uncle, was co-owner of this estate. He helped build the Fairmont name from the ground up, and when he died, you and father took everything from him." Gasps rippled through the hall like wind through leaves. Faces turned toward Beatrice, searching for denial. She opened her mouth, but no words came. I stepped forward then, my hands trembling slightly as I pulled a bundle of faded letters from my purse. "These," I said, "are my father's letters and agreements, signed and dated, proof that he was cheated out of what was rightfully his." I laid them on the nearest table, the parchment glowing under the chandelier's light. A murmur spread. Shock, disbelief, outrage. A woman in pearls whispered, "My God, it's all true." Beatrice's glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the marble floor. She staggered slightly, reaching for a nearby chair. The mask she'd worn for decades was cracking, and beneath it was something raw and ugly. Fear. Adrian's voice softened, though it carried through the room. "Mother, it didn't have to be like this. You could have made it right years ago." Beatrice looked up at him, her expression trembling between fury and grief. "You would destroy your own mother's name for her?" He shook his head. "No, Mother, you destroyed it yourself." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I took a step closer to her. "I never wanted revenge," I said quietly, my voice breaking. "I wanted respect. I wanted you to look at me and see more than the child of your mistake." Beatrice pressed a hand to her chest, her breathing shallow. For a moment I thought she might apologize, but the fire in her eyes told me otherwise. She sat straighter, her chin lifting, pride clinging to her like armor. "You think you've won, Clara," she whispered. "You've taken everything. My son, my reputation, this house. But you'll regret it. Mark my words." Her tone was calm, almost eerily so, but the venom beneath it chilled me. Adrian moved between us, his voice low but firm. "It's over, Mother." She smiled faintly, a slow, dangerous curve. "Oh, my dear boy. Nothing is ever truly over." The room erupted into whispers again, people shifting, gossip already forming into stories they'd retell for years. Adrian reached for my hand once more, grounding me as the chaos swirled around us. I could feel his pulse through his fingers, steady, defiant. But even as he led me away from the center of the storm, I felt Beatrice's gaze burning into my back, her final words echoing in my mind. "You'll regret it." And in that moment, I couldn't tell whether it was a threat or a promise. The party had ended hours ago, yet the house still hummed with the echo of what had been said. Guests had scattered like startled birds, their whispers already flying through the night toward the small towns and parlors beyond. The servants had retreated in silence, leaving only the faint clinking of glass and the rustle of curtains in the heavy air. Adrian stood by the door, shoulders tense, while I lingered in the hall outside the ballroom. The smell of spilled champagne mixed with wilted roses. For all the grandeur, the house felt smaller now, emptier, stripped of its illusions. I was about to follow Adrian upstairs when I heard a soft, uneven breath behind me. Beatrice was slumped in a chair near the staircase, her hand clutching the armrest as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The woman who had ruled this house for decades suddenly looked fragile, her composure fractured. For a moment, I wanted to walk away. She had earned her fall, every cruel word and act catching up with her. But something deep inside me, perhaps the part that still carried my mother's compassion, stopped me. I walked toward her quietly. "Aunt Beatrice," I said softly. Her eyes fluttered open, dull but sharp enough to recognize me. "Come to gloat, have you?" "No," I said, "to help you upstairs." She laughed bitterly. "How noble. Even now you can't stop playing the saint." I ignored the barb and slipped an arm under hers, helping her to her feet. She resisted at first, but her legs trembled too much for pride to hold her up. Slowly we made our way to her room. The hallways were dim, lined with portraits of ancestors whose cold gazes seemed to watch our uneasy procession. Once inside, I helped her sit on the edge of her bed. The emerald fabric of her gown pooled around her like fallen leaves. She looked smaller somehow, swallowed by the grandeur she had built. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Because it's the right thing to do," I said simply. Her lips twisted into a faint smile. "You sound like your mother, always clinging to kindness like it was armor." I met her gaze. Maybe it was, but it kept her human. Something flickered in Beatrice's expression, something I had never seen before. She turned her head toward the window, watching the moonlight spill across the floor. "I used to envy her, you know," she said suddenly. "Your mother. She was light. People loved her without effort. I had to earn every ounce of affection I ever received." Her voice cracked. "And I never could." The admission stunned me. It was the first time she had spoken without her armor, without the poison of pride. For a moment, she wasn't the formidable matriarch, just a tired woman mourning her own choices. "I didn't want to hate you," I said softly. "But I did." Beatrice gave a small, sad smile. "Then we're even. I hated you too, because you reminded me of what I wasn't." Her words lingered in the air, heavy but honest. I nodded slowly, not with agreement, but understanding. I left her room quietly, closing the door behind me. In the hallway, Adrian waited. His eyes softened when he saw me. "You helped her," he said, almost in disbelief. "She's still your mother," I replied, "and my aunt." He took my hand gently, his thumb tracing small circles against my skin. "You're remarkable, you know that?" I smiled faintly. "No, just tired." He chuckled under his breath. "Then let me carry the burden for a while." The next morning, as the first light crept through the curtains, Adrian called a family lawyer to finalize the new deeds. Half the estate, half of everything Beatrice had taken, was transferred to me. I stood beside him as he signed the papers. My name looked strange next to his on the document, like something that shouldn't have been possible, and yet there it was. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. "Strange," I admitted. "Vindicated, maybe, but mostly humbling." He smiled. "That's what makes you different, Clara. You don't take joy in winning. You take peace in justice." Later that week, I returned to my little cottage by the train tracks. The walls still carried the same cracks, the same scent of old wood and lavender, but I wasn't the same woman who had left it. I walked through each room slowly, touching the worn furniture, whispering a silent goodbye to every memory that had once hurt me. Word of the party had spread faster than either of us expected. By the time I visited the market, people looked at me differently. There were no whispers, no pitying glances, only nods of quiet respect. For the first time in decades, my father's name was spoken with dignity again. Adrian visited often, never with grand gestures, only steady companionship. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch drinking tea, the sound of trains echoing in the distance. He never pressured me to decide anything about us, only waited with patience that spoke louder than words. I found myself thinking about forgiveness, not as surrender, but as freedom. Forgiving Beatrice didn't erase what she'd done, but it freed me from carrying the weight of it. A few months later, news spread that Beatrice had left the country for health reasons. Some said she went to France. Others whispered about a quiet villa near the coast. Her legacy was tarnished, but she had chosen exile over pity. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the fields, Adrian came to see me again. He brought no papers, no plans, only that familiar look in his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the same velvet box from the morning of the proposal. The gold band caught the sunset, glowing softly. He knelt before me on the porch steps, his voice quiet but certain. "Clara," he said, "now that everything's finally ours to choose, what does your heart truly want?" The words hung between us, tender and terrifying, and for the first time, I realized the answer might finally be mine to give. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. Adrian remained kneeling before me, the sunset brushing his shoulders in gold, the ring glinting between us like a promise reborn. I felt the weight of all the years, the rejection, the loneliness, the quiet ache of never feeling enough, dissolve in that single instant. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, Adrian, I will." His eyes closed briefly, a smile of relief breaking across his face. When he slipped the ring onto my finger, my hands didn't tremble this time. There was no fear left, only peace. He stood, pulling me gently into his arms. "You don't know how long I've waited to hear that." I smiled against his shoulder. Maybe we both needed to wait until we were free. We married 3 weeks later, quietly and simply, in the garden where it had all begun. The same roses that once framed whispered insults from my aunt now bloomed in full blush around us. The willow tree stood tall at the edge of the estate, its branches swaying gently in the summer breeze, like it remembered the children we once were. There were no grand announcements, no society columns to print our names, only a handful of people who mattered. Adrian wore a navy suit, and I chose a cream dress trimmed with lace, one my mother had sewn decades ago. It felt like carrying her with me. As we stood beneath the arbor, the air filled with the faint scent of jasmine. The minister spoke softly, but I barely heard him. All I could think about was how far I had come from the girl who once stirred tea to hide her shaking hands. When Adrian said his vows, his voice caught slightly. "You've taught me what family really means," he said. "Not status, not bloodlines, heart. And you are my heart, Clara." I smiled through tears. "And you," I said, "are my home." The words felt right, honest. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider stepping into someone else's world. I felt like I belonged exactly where I stood. After the ceremony, we hosted a small luncheon on the terrace. The sunlight danced across the table, the laughter gentle and genuine. What surprised me most were the faces among the guests. People who had once avoided me now smiling warmly, some offering apologies without words. Mrs. Langley, who had smirked at my little cottage months before, took my hand and said softly, "Your mother would be proud." I believed her. Even the servants, who had once looked at me with quiet sympathy, now spoke to me as though I had always been part of the house. Respect had replaced pity, and it felt like healing. At one point, Adrian leaned toward me and whispered, "See? You didn't just earn your place. You reminded everyone what belonging really means." I looked at him, my heart swelling. "No," I said softly. "You reminded me." He smiled, brushing his thumb along my hand. "You've always belonged, Clara." The words settled over me like sunlight. They weren't grand or dramatic, just true. Later that evening, as the guests drifted away and the lamps began to glow across the garden, I walked alone to the far end of the estate. The air was warm, the sky fading into shades of lavender and rose. I found myself standing near the bench where Beatrice had once told me, "You don't belong here." The memory didn't sting anymore. In her absence, I'd learned that sometimes people cling to cruelty because it's the only language they know. I had spent too many years resenting her, but tonight I let it go. "I forgive you," I whispered into the wind. "Not for you, but for me." Somewhere in the quiet, I felt the weight lift. Forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was release. In the months that followed, Adrian and I transformed the Fairmont estate into something new. The East Wing became the Winslow House, a charity home for struggling families, named in honor of my parents. The halls that once echoed with gossip now carried the laughter of children and the hum of possibility. Every morning, I'd walk the grounds with Adrian, The garden's alive again under our care. The same rooms that had once symbolized division now breathed with life and kindness. Sometimes I'd pause at the drawing room window, the very spot where I'd first poured tea for my aunt. I'd pour myself a cup now and smile at the reflection in the glass. For the first time, I would say to myself, the tea tastes sweet. Life had come full circle, from rejection to belonging, from shame to pride. On the evening of our first anniversary, Adrian and I sat on the veranda, the sunset painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. The scent of roses drifted through the air. He reached over and covered my hand with his. "Do you ever think about her?" he asked quietly. "Sometimes," I said, "but not with anger. I think maybe she finally found her peace in her own way." He nodded. "She'd never admit it, but I think she knew she was wrong." "Maybe," I said, smiling faintly, "and maybe that's enough." We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the rustle of the leaves, the soft chirp of crickets. Everything felt still, complete. I lifted my cup of tea, watching the steam curl in the twilight. Once, I had stirred sugar to disguise the trembling in my hands, to hide the taste of bitterness that life had given me. Now, as I stirred, I felt only gratitude. "The woman who once stirred sugar to hide her tears," I whispered, smiling, "now stirs it to share her joy." And with that, I finally felt what my mother had always promised me I would someday find: peace. True, sweet peace. In the end, I realized revenge was never the victory I wanted. Peace was. My aunt's words once made me feel small, but now they remind me how far I've come. The house that once silenced me now echoes with laughter and love. Adrian gave me a new life, but finding my own worth gave me freedom. And every time I pour my tea now, I remember, I've finally learned what it means to belong. If this story touched something in your heart, don't forget to share it. Someone out there might need this reminder today. Your support keeps stories like mine alive, and every like or comment helps another voice find its strength again. Tell me, have you ever been told you don't belong, only to prove you always did? I'd love to hear your story in the comments.